Welcome to the Personality Couch podcast, where we discuss all things personality and clinical practice. I'm your host, Doc Bach, and I'm here with my co-host, Doc Fish. We are both licensed clinical psychologists in private practice, and today we are continuing our series on avoidant personality disorder. In this episode, we unpack Millon's 6 avoidant subtypes, and we begin by looking at a few fun historical names before unpacking the mild, moderate, and severe versions of avoidant personality. So let's get to it. While we couldn't find any historical subtypes apart from Millon's, we did find some interesting names and descriptions in history that Millon later tied to the avoidant personality. So Schneider in 1923 and 1950 coined the term aesthetic personality, which was characterized by being prone to hypochondriasis, or basically hyper-attuned to the body and its dysfunction.
Which is very different from schizoid, because they are disconnected from the self, so they're not going to be preoccupied with any of the body stuff.
And then Millon also pulled from Kretschmer's work, noting a deep insecurity and panic in these aesthetic types, often withdrawing from the social world. He further noted that they are masochistic and blame themselves easily and are chronically malcontent.
And then we have Kretschmer's anesthetic and hyperanesthetic continuum, which we talked about in our first episode. So it's essentially a continuum of insensitivity, or the anesthetic, at one end, and then the sensitivity or hyperaesthetic on the other end.
So Kahn in 1931 coined the term passive autist. So again, like autistic, but not quite. So passive autist, which described difficulties with a fragmented sense of self where there's a conflict between being assertive and being submissive, seeing the self as inept, unable to speak up, and this personality rides on resentment and thus hides from the world.
Okay, so I do see where these traits are helpful to split off from schizoid, because they may be schizoid or they may not be, but they can be part of multiple types of personalities.
So Millon mentions Reich in 1933, who uses the word schizoid to describe the dynamics of the avoidant type. So this type armors themselves with walls that conceal and consume the infantile anxiety. So what that means is basically that stoicism is a way to counter the anxiety inside.
Okay, so sounds a bit schizoidish, defending the mind castle maybe, but not necessarily because of extreme inner anxiety.
Yeah. So then Mininger in 1930 also used the term isolated personalities, described as wistful outsiders. So they want to be social, but don't know where to start and are overwhelmed by fear. So feelings of social ineptitude and oddities emerge because of that fear and ultimately lead to not belonging in the group. So it's a feedback loop of, I feel odd, so I act odd, so people perceive me as odd.
I think maybe this sounds like a traumatized personality. So for example, I think I've seen this as a very real dynamic in many people and maybe increased in the kids that grew up in the COVID era. But it's not necessarily a schizoid dynamic, because schizoids don't usually have a fear of humiliation or not belonging.
Yeah, I can see that. So then we also have phobic character, which I know you're familiar with, Doc Fish. This came up in 1945 by analysts like Finichel. So phobic characters move away from the desired situations or things out of fear.
Okay, so McKinnon and Michaels in 1971 had a great quote. So they said that these phobic characters are preoccupied with security. So they fear any possible threat to it, constantly imagining the self in situations of danger while pursuing the course of greatest safety, which I think sounds like an Enneagram 6.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I agree with you there. So there were a couple other kind of honorable mentions, so including Rado's overreactive disorders and Horney's detached type, which all sound a little like the avoidant type that we know today.
Okay, so we can see a theme here that maybe these types, which later were coined as avoidant personalities by Millon, are fearful. So they have a distinctly poor view of the self, chronic low self-esteem, and are incredibly anxious, often keeping their distance socially for fear of criticism or disapproval. Like they don't want others to see their faults on full display.
Yeah, exactly. But I do think we need to move to Millon's 6 subtypes.
Let's go. So as a quick recap, Millon divides up his subtypes into 3 categories of severity. There's mild, moderate, and severe.
Mhm.
Each category has 2 subtypes for a total of 6.
Yeah. Okay. So for the mild avoidant types, they likely aren't going to present to treatment. Overall, they struggle with hypersensitivity and moving away from others if they feel uncertain of being liked and not criticized. So there's a radar for potential rejection, and they use this extreme caution when engaging with others. Unsurprisingly, as we've been talking about, they have low self esteem and are shy and hesitant. However, when they are in safe settings and feel socially secure, they actually can function well.
Exactly. So they're self-conscious and uncertain of being accepted by others, resulting in being wary in new situations. They're expecting to be embarrassed. They feel really uneasy socially. So they
Mhm.
do have like a super antenna that constantly scans their surroundings to pick up on where the danger might be.
Yeah.
So unsurprisingly, they prefer to be alone unless they feel safe.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that. The super antennae, very sensitive. So the first of the mild subtypes is the anxiously shy type. Okay, so characteristics of this type include being private, feeling tense, being fearful. However, they can look gentle, calm, and put together on the outside. But under the surface, they are always on the lookout and anticipating problems.
Okay, so Milan wrote that they are, quote, searching for escape through self knowledge, but seem to be lost at times in a never ending quest for self revelation, a quest that, at its core, has a desire for achieving psychic peace of mind.
Ooh, that's interesting. Searching for peace from within.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So peace isn't fully there due to that chronic pain and anguish about existence, leading to withdrawal into the self. But
Mm-hmm.
what do you think this means, Doc Fish?
Yeah, I think it means that they are rejecting or avoiding their emotions, moving into their head and their mind to handle things.
Yeah.
But socially, they avoid being the center of attention. But they do want to be recognized, but also they want to be seen, but like they don't actually want to be seen. It's a conflict.
Yeah.
They avoid social situations.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, they'll avoid those confrontations, conflict, like any potential disagreements to blend in. And they lack assertiveness, really, and have difficulty speaking up for their needs.
Mm-hmm. And they can appear to have very low energy and be sluggish.
Mhm.
They're not efficient, they're not practical, and they can actually have a lot of difficulty finishing what they start because of self criticism and a fear of external evaluation.
Yeah, yeah. So feelings of inadequacy, low confidence, and devaluing the self are really prominent features here of this
Mm-hmm.
type. So, given the right person, they might let their guard down and express themselves. But if not, they can fade into the background and disconnect from the world.
There are some similarities here with schizoid, especially in the withdrawal into the self, the existential struggle, and low energy. But the core that makes this avoidant is the fear of negative evaluation, sensitivity to rejection, and low self esteem. But enough about that. Let's look at the next subtype.
Yes. Okay. So the next type is the imaginatively shy subtype. So this type is prone to fantasy, daydreaming, and imagination as an escape from the difficult reality. So these types are socially hesitant, preferring to avoid social troubles. If they do engage in the social world, they find a niche to increase their security and psychic stability, social peace, and predictability.
Okay, so imaginatively shy avoidants minimize social interactions because they believe that relationships do not last and aren't genuine. So they're reclusive.
Yeah.
As a result, they depend on the self. They do not depend on others. They're not concerned with others' welfare, but at the same time, they're pretty apathetic. They don't take initiative to have a better life, but they do fantasize about it.
Yeah. And they're their own worst enemy, really, like not living up to their own expectations. So, socially, there's discomfort and distrust of others, and they can guard their fantasies and have a hard time accepting perspectives that differ from their own. And in these fantasies, they can actually become fairly rigid, like getting into the weeds about right and wrong and procedures and things of that nature. And at the same time, they don't have any mojo to make the change that the world needs. So they just stew about it in their minds.
Right, right. And then with that rigidity comes control of the environment, so they can be meticulous and impose structure.
So this is where there's some obsessive compulsive flavors here.
There might be. So similar to the anxiously shy, they are also not competitive. They have low self-esteem. They can actually be so passive on an interpersonal situations that they're self-sacrificing.
Yeah. So the defining feature of the imaginative shy is their withdrawal into their
Mhm.
mind and their focus on the self, versus the anxiously shy has a little more focus on others and keeping the peace, but they're still withdrawn due to that anxiety.
Mhm. And I see a little bit of overlap with schizoid here with all that fantasy stuff, but the anxious rigidity definitely fits with a more anxious, avoidant, phobic, or maybe compulsive flavor. But Milan doesn't tell us any of his thoughts on this.
Yeah, yeah. The difference is the phobic or avoidant character's behavior is anxiety driven, really. And the schizoid may or may not be driven by anxiety, but they both can withdraw into their minds. That's the behavior that we see. Yeah.
Mhm. So, interesting stuff. It gets a little easier to understand the difference between the moderate subtypes. So, with that, let's go to the moderate level where we have two subtypes again. We have the hypersensitively reticent and the phobically reticent subtypes. So, the overall defining feature here is that both of these mild types that we just talked about can disintegrate into the moderate due to isolation and fewer opportunities for personal growth.
We'll start first with the hypersensitively reticent subtype, which overlaps with paranoid features. These types are often high strung, prickly, suspicious, and hypervigilant to potential rejection or abuse. Essentially, they look critically at their environment, kind of side eyeing it for potential threats.
Yes, and they can be moody with rapidly shifting emotions and potentially long periods of edginess and self deprecation. They expect rejection, but sometimes they'll be sad about it. Sometimes they'll be irrationally negativistic about it. This quote from Milan really stuck out to me. So he said that a hypersensitive reticent is apt to make the molehill of a minor and passing slight into a mountain of personal ridicule and condemnation.
Oh, what an interesting quote. Yeah, that would be hard to live with, right? Like, yeah, so their moodiness also is going to come up from this pent up resentment. Like,
Hmm.
and they try not to express anger and suppress it, but it comes out anyway, like kind of
Hmm.
sideways. So in social situations, they can, quote, be unpredictable, irritably edgy, and negativistic, engaging at times in wrangles and disappointments with others, vacillating between moments of being agreeable, sullenly passive, and irritably angry, according to Millon. Yeah.
Yes. And keeping with the moody theme, while they can appear apathetic because they do try to squish down the sensitivity, their intense, contrary emotions will come out in like peevish and immature outbursts.
Right. So then they do feel guilty about how they act, but they also feel like misunderstood, unappreciated, and demeaned, which in some way justifies their moodiness and their anger. So in their negativity, they believe that positive things in their life won't even last.
Yep. All right. So the second moderate type is the phobically reticent subtype, which overlaps with dependent features.
Hmm.
So they cannot get relief from their constant generalized anxiety. They very, very, very much want connection and closeness, but they don't trust others and they fear rejection from them. But they also don't want to express their fear of loss because, like, what if it makes it happen?
Right. Yeah. Like speaking the fear into existence.
Mhm.
Yeah. So then they displace their anxieties to something safer or like what is called a phobic object.
So the phobic object allows them to redirect and discharge their fears while neither being conscious of them nor having to deal with them forthrightly, which means that they can then handle and tolerate any loss of that phobic object.
So, what might this phobic object be?
Goodness. So it's just something tangible and acceptable. So, for example, it's not going to be the romantic partner, it might be the dog next door. It's
Hmm.
not going to be the social situation at the public pool. It's going to be like a fear of swimming. So it's like a symbolic representation of the fear.
Okay, this makes sense. So it's displaced fear onto something safer.
Mhm.
So it's like it's not the fear of like being close to others. It's like fear of that confined space. Like I just hate elevators, right? I
Mhm.
don't like heights. So it's like a generalized anxiety that is then displaced onto a thing that makes it acceptable, right?
Exactly. Mhm.
Yeah. So speaking of phobic, though, they are unsurprisingly prone to social phobia as they fear rejection and humiliation.
Exactly. So the difference between the hypersensitive reticent and the phobic reticent is that the hypersensitive type is super moody and they suppress their fear and need for others. The phobically reticent seems to displace it somewhere where they don't actually have to acknowledge and face it.
Exactly. Yeah, like we talked about, the elevator, the swimming pool, the dog, like it's not about the person, it's about the feared thing. But in a psychological reversal, it really is about the feared person or people. Yeah.
You got it. So, these moderate types can disintegrate easily due to increased isolation. And so, with that, let's move to the severe level, which means we're possibly at the avoidant personality disorder territory.
Yeah. So at this disorder level, avoidance withdraw from reality. They fear humiliation and rejection so much that they disengage from reality and others to protect themselves and tend to their wounds alone. It becomes intentional social isolation at this level. And here we have the conflicted avoidant and the self deserting avoidant.
Oh boy. All right. We'll start with the conflicted avoidant subtype, and they actually showcase more negativistic features. So, their main conflict is that they want to be detached, but then they're scared of being independent. So, they want attachment, closeness, acceptance, affection, but anticipate experiencing like really intense pain and disillusionment, which is then paired with like low self esteem. So if they try to be independent, they fear failure would lead them to humiliation.
Aha.
Okay, so they have to rely on others, support people, institutions, etc., but they do so with very deep resentment,
Mhm.
which means the conflict remains, right? They can't act alone because of self doubt, but they can't rely on others because of mistrust.
Aha. Yeah. So grumpy and negativistic, these types sometimes lash out at others for not seeing their needs, like for affection and nurturance, which
Hmm.
risks their dependent security on the other. So to handle these conflicted feelings and anger, they withdraw and are anxious with a chronic, like dysphoric, sullen mood. So they are stuck in a cycle. Like these outbursts lead to feeling humiliated, which leads to withdrawing out of protection and then anger about the conflict, leading to more outbursts.
Okay. Okay. So, said another way, it's the cycle of constraint, and then that leads to angry acting out, and then that leads to remorse and regret. And it's all because they suppress their anger, and it can lead to impulsive hostility.
Yeah. So conflicted avoidants are moody. Like they feel misunderstood, not appreciated, demeaned. And then sometimes, though, when they're not stressed, they're in denial of previous resentments and
Mm,
present the self as well, right? But this false veneer cracks easily under the pressure or stress of life.
exactly. That leads us to the last of the severe subtypes, which is the self deserting avoidant. So, the self deserting avoidant subtype overlaps with melancholic and sometimes schizotypal features. So, they
Ooh.
withdraw into the self to avoid any discomfort regarding relating to other people. They usually start with fantasy as a coping skill, but then they find that fantasy isn't enough. It just highlights their pain and their misery and their anguish. So they succeed in avoiding social exposure and humiliation, but then they can't escape their inner torment, which is melancholic. So they can't turn to others. They're socially aversive. But then there's also high self-devaluation and merging avoidant and depressive or melancholic personalities.
Okay, so they end up kind of seeking to undo their self conscious awareness, which then results in abandoning the self. Like they neglect their well being and have trouble with even the smallest inkling of self care,
Mhm.
right? So tragically, some actually head towards suicide. And then some also head towards emotional numbness through whatever means that could mean for them. So sometimes the avoidance of the cognitive self awareness might lead to a splitting of consciousness. So this is actually very similar to schizotypals, right? So that's where reality and the self start to fall apart and fragment, becoming disorganized. So help me break down this what this means though, Doc Fish, because this is really deep.
Okay. All right. So not only do they reject others because socializing is intolerable, they start to reject the self because their inner world becomes intolerable,
Uh-huh.
which leads to a breakdown in their thought organization and reality.
Yeah, everything is just too much.
Mhm.
People are too much. Inner thoughts are too much. Abandon the self and split off.
Mhm.
Oof, yikes. Okay, so the conflicted avoidant is another more severely disintegrated moody type. But the difference between the conflicted and the self deserting types is that the conflicted deals with their conflict of dependency and rejection by acting out and then withdrawing in this vicious, tantruming, moody cycle. The self deserting, though, reacts to this conflict not necessarily externally, but internally. So they split off from the self because the conflict inside is intolerable.
That's exactly right. Now, I do think it would be helpful to share our thoughts and opinions about Millon's subtypes, though we've been fairly opinionated about his work thus far in this series.
That we have. Yes, we have been pretty critical in this whole series about Milan's coining of avoidant personality disorder, even though we think he's one of the greatest personality shrinks of all times. But that said, we do both agree that avoidant personality does have some unique traits. Like there's something here.
Mhm.
Milan was picking up on something. Like we're just not quite sure that it should be a disorder in the DSM. And one of the critiques that we and other theorists have is that avoidant overlaps so much with a lot of the other personality disorders. But let's break this down just a little bit more.
One thing I can't help but question is the difference between these subtypes and corresponding like opposite subtypes in the other personalities. So for example, for the avoidant, Milan has the hypersensitive with paranoid flavors. But then he has an insular paranoid subtype that has avoidant flavors. So it makes me wonder like how different are they really?
Yeah.
Or the phobic for the avoidant, they have the dependent features, but then there's also a disquieted dependent subtype with avoidant features.
Hmm.
So are they different? How different can we really actually separate the avoidant from these overlaps in other personalities? Now, I can't technically answer this question yet because I haven't dove too deep into some of these other personalities, but I'm curious. It makes me question it.
I see what you're saying here. Like in most of Milan's subtypes across personalities, he notes that each subtype has features of other personality types. And to your point, how do you know which dysfunctional personality style is driving the bus? Like, are they different types of the same thing? Like, I'm thinking of cheese right now. Like, let's use a cheese analogy.
All right.
Okay. So, are some of these subtypes like distinguishing between mild and sharp cheddar? Like, at the end of the day, it's still cheddar cheese. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, so gee, like how moldy are they at their core?
Oh,
Yeah.
that too. That too. Yeah. And just keeping with the cheese analogy, hang with me for a sec. With some of these subtypes, like, are they blends of cheeses that have been rebranded to be something different, but really it's just the same thing. Like kind of like if I were to mix mild and sharp cheddars, add in a Monterey Jack and call it like a mac and cheese blend, at the end of the day, it's the same thing. It's just rebranded, repackaged, repurposed. Sorry, Millon.
I really like that. That's a good cheese analogy. I like it.
Yeah.
Now, according to the DSM, there is a lot of overlap between avoidant and schizoid, schizotypal, dependent, and paranoid.
Yeah.
Now, negativistic isn't a disorder in the DSM anymore, but it used to be called passive-aggressive personality disorder. I think that personally fits with the conflicts of the avoidant. So then are we back to the question of whether avoidant is its own personality disorder, a trait? Is it its own cheese?
Is it its own cheese? Does it have a buddy? What else did it get packaged with? Yep. I mean, that's been our question this whole series. Is it even a standalone diagnosis? So, I mean, we have our opinions, but for now, we'll leave it up to our listeners and viewers to cast their vote on YouTube. That poll is still open about whether or not you think it should be a diagnosis. So we're also curious about what you think with these subtypes and if you identify with them. So let us know in the comments if so. All right, so today we unpacked the 6 avoidant personality subtypes according to Millon and shared some of our thoughts and opinions about them as well. So we hope that you'll tune in for the rest of the series and don't forget to like, subscribe, give us a shout out. We've also got blogs, visuals, and references that coincide with each episode at www.personalitycouch.com. And if you're a provider looking to consult about a case, or if you're in need of psychodynamic therapy or a deep dive psychological evaluation, Quest Psych can help with that. I'll provide a link in the show notes. Be well, be kind. We'll see you next time on The Personality Couch. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute a professional relationship. If you're in need of professional help, please seek out appropriate resources in your area. Information about clinical trends or diagnoses are discussed in broad and universal terms and do not refer to any specific person or case.